public filter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. So I think like the best way to start is to ask each of the panelists to talk a little bit about their perspective about their interactions of theory and empirical work in finance at this point. Like they are noticing any trends, they're seeing challenges, and get the discussion going this way. So whoever wants to start, please.
Okay, so we go alphabetically?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you for hosting the panel and thank you for doing the conference. I think it's a great initiative of FTG to bridge theory and empirical work. I'll start by saying that I think it's very important to bridge theory and empirical work. I think different people think about it differently, what it means to bridge theory and empirical work. I will say that in my view, it doesn't have to be the case that when we think about both theory and empirical, we have to put them both in the same paper. Sometimes it is the case that we want to have both theory and empirical, but it's not always the case. I think when we want to bridge the two types of work, we basically want theorists and empiricists to interact with each other, communicate with each other, and learn from each other. So that means that theoretical papers will have an eye towards the empiricists who might be looking at it later and doing something with the theory. And empiricists should be guided by theory to some extent when they run empirical tests. And that's what I would like to see more in the profession. I think over the years we see, that's at least my view, other people can comment on that, but we do see that there is some tendency to drift apart a little bit, and I think it's very important to integrate and have this kind of communication. When it comes to that, I think maybe I'll try to be a little more specific what it means for theory to have empirics in mind when the model is written and vice versa. So I'll start with theory and I'll say, I think in many cases people like to think that theory papers should have very clear empirical predictions, kind of like a recipe at the end of the paper. You know, if you want to now test the model, this is what you need to do, ABC. Or maybe people like to judge the quality of theory based on whether it generates something that we actually see in the data. And I will push against that. I think that's not how we should judge theoretical papers. I think a good theory paper, in my opinion, is a paper that has a sound base of assumptions. So basically, the assumptions kind of tell you, you know, this is what you're studying, this is what you want to look at, this is what you want to understand. And I think when we think about the assumptions, we want to have something that is relevant, that tells us something about the world that we see in the real world. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly the real world, but at least it's motivated by the real world or provides some benchmark to the real world. So I think we want to pick our assumptions very carefully to be relevant, to be interesting as a basis for theory work. And then the other thing I think that is critical in making a theory paper successful is that you learn something from the model. So, you know, you don't want a model where you just make a bunch of assumptions and then you get a result that is very close to the assumptions. I think you always ask yourself, did I learn something from the analysis? Is there any value added from the analysis? And I would say these two ingredients are critical for good theory. Both relevant assumptions, assumptions that you think are important for understanding the real world, and then sound analysis, insightful analysis, something that comes out of the analysis that you could not fully anticipate. Now, the third thing is, you know, whether at the end of the day your results are compatible with the data. And, you know, it's always good that they are, but if you get something that is not compatible with the data, I will not say it's a failure. Rather, I will say you learn something from the model, and maybe it pushes you going forward to think more about, you know, how could this be tested, what's going on, maybe we need to make some some adjustments and so on. So I would not judge a theory paper based on whether the results are what we see in the data or not. So that's how I think about how theory should be informed by empirics. On the other side, I think it's simpler. I think that when you write empirical papers, you want to be motivated by theory. I think most empirical papers are motivated by theory to some extent, but I think there is a benefit to making that a little stronger. So that's that.
I guess I'm next. I don't think I have huge big picture things to say on this topic. So let me be small picture. Let's kind of work off of what Song started saying yesterday. I think a lot of that's going to come out later, which is how do we sort of think about combining empirics and theory, especially models, in a paper? I think we've got to step back, and I think this is. Don't think I do this. This is I wish I did this. I'm sure I fail all the time. Okay, this is like advice that you give, but you don't take yourself. But I think for me, now having been on the other side for a couple of years, what we all should kind of be aware of is that at the end of the day, you're writing this for people to read. And people have limited attention span and limited patience. And you need to sort of say, what's the one important thing I want to communicate to people? Not 3, not 5, not 17. What's the one important thing I want to communicate to people? And that should be something new. It should be something new relative to some literature ideally. Okay, but it should be something. And then organize the paper in that way. And sometimes that means I have a new empirical insight, and you do that. And then the question is, okay, now, how do we why are economics useful? Economics are useful because we have a framework. The framework is theory. Think about things clearly, right? You can't sort of say things that are not internally consistent. Right? That's theory. And a lot of times you sort of see people having a bunch of results, and there's some broad thing that is kind of internally consistent, but there's extraneous things that are not even internally consistent with like the main flow of the argument. And I think that's what we need. And a lot of times, people then put in a formal model to try to kind of do that. But then if the formal model can be explained by words, like there's one comparative stat, if costs of this are higher, then you do less of it. I don't want to read 4 pages of something very obvious to then get to the central point. Write it in a paragraph that sort of gets it, and then you move on. And what's the central contribution? You've shown this in the data. And so I think a lot of it has to be step back, ask yourself, what am I trying to communicate to the audience of the paper, and find the most efficient way to communicate it. And sometimes that is leaning very heavily on data, and explain the coherent framework, which I think when we say we want more theory, I think it's like you want a coherent framework where everything hangs together in one story. If you can explain that one coherent story in a paragraph or 2, do not tax people with formal notation on 4 pages. Because then they'll be exhausted by the time they get to like what's new. And vice versa. And I think, then, structural models in some ways are even worse. Because you're taxing people worse. Right? You're making them work through empirical work. And then you're making them work through a model. And then estimation, and then counterfactual. So if you're making people work through all this work, there better be an awesome payoff for the reader at the end of the exercise. And the awesome payoff for the reader at the end of the exercise should be the main point that you kind of try to push in the beginning. And if there isn't, you just taxed hours out of many people's lives. To not deliver that, like that's a failure, right? And I think that's where we all kind of fail. We get into, this is really cool for me, and look at this, all these awesome thoughts I have around this topic. But not stepping back and saying, and now let me distill this for someone who's really impatient and who needs to learn one thing from my paper. That'd be my big sort of theory, a big picture of empirical work and theory together. Like, do them in a way that's targeted to the reader. But, that's probably obvious. I don't know. But I fail all the time, so not that obvious to me. Okay? That's all I'll say for now.
All right. I think these were all insightful points. Let me maybe take it like a slightly different sense. So first, I think debating the merits of theory, empirical work, quantitative work, structural work it's a little bit like people arguing over a toolbox, and there's a hammer and there's a screwdriver, and one guy says, oh no, it just always use the hammer, and somebody else says, no, the hammer, we don't need the hammer, just the screwdriver. And needless to say, this is a futile argument, and it's when it comes to nail, the hammer is a pretty useful tool. When when we're dealing with screws, well, maybe the screwdriver will be useful. So I feel like we should. The starting point for me is theory is very useful. Empirical work is exceptionally useful, including descriptive work, so reduced form work. But so is quantitative or structural work. And so we should think about the relative, we should really think about what is the question that we're trying to answer, what are we trying to accomplish. I think in thinking about what the panel was about, I was trying to think about, well, why are we, by some metric, some people are under the impression that there's a theory winter, not coming, it has already started. The question is why would that be? And I think what I thought about is that one thing that has happened over the last, decade or two is that there's been some methodological progress in both in terms of numerical methods that allows quantitative work, and to some extent it facilitates the structural estimation, and also there's been some innovation in terms of tools for handling big data sets and new data sources. So how is that related to this debate then? I think what happens is, in particular, so for example, let's take one step at a time, quantitative and structural work to some extent. When you do quantitative work, part of what the improved numerical tools have allowed us to do is handle models with more ingredients. And there's a temptation then to, when you go quantitative, to add a lot of ingredients. So in some sense, if you want, the shadow cost of extra ingredients has kind of collapsed in quantitative work. And the shadow cost of extra ingredients in theory is exceptionally high. It's often prohibitively expensive to add extra ingredients. And so then there's this temptation to think so then always go quantitative. You can have extra ingredients, and particularly if your model, if your model that you're trying to make quantitative fails on some dimension, no problem. Just think, put one more ingredient to fix this dimension in which the model doesn't fit the data. And it's almost, because the shadow cost is so low, it's almost impossible to resist the temptation to fix the model to also deliver on this other dimension, which was a dimension that you didn't want to talk about. This is kind of what Gregor was saying. There's one aspect of the data that you're trying to talk about. There's other aspects that are auxiliary, but it's too cheap to try to deliver on them. And I think it kind of goes back to what is a model. A model is an abstraction. It should capture the essence, and it should actually. It should, in some sense, kind of a model, a beautiful, simple model that explains the data well is often preferable to a more complicated model that is awkward and that explains the data better. But I think it is very important. Actually understanding that and understanding what the role of a model is of the essence then. So when people do quantitative work, actually I feel like we should impose a higher penalty on essentially theorists on bringing free parameters into the equation. So I wish a lot of the quantitative work actually would refrain from the temptation to try to speak to other features of the data that are not of the essence for the question at hand. So be, in some sense, more conservative and be closer to the theory. And I think the theory also should be able to theorists also should be able to deliver models that in some dimensions fail, but those are not the key is whether they capture the essence in the dimension that they're trying to speak to. And so I think in some sense part of this tension is about new technologies allow new types of models with many ingredients, and then revisiting like what is the point of models then with few ingredients. But I do think that they're actually exceptionally valuable. In fact, and I think it's a little bit similar with the new tools in terms of handling big data sets. But I think for now I'll just stop there and we can revisit later.
Can you all hear me? You can. I want to talk about something totally different, which is empirical work. Because I'm not the oldest person in the room, but I'm doggone close. And so I've been watching empirical work for decades now. And it's evolved, and it's come full circle, and it's gone from being related to theory to utterly unrelated to theory, and back to related to theory a little bit. So back in the old days, people had these papers where they would develop verbal hypotheses based on theory papers they have written. And then they ran some regressions, and there were endogeneity problems all over the place, and the regressions were super hard to interpret. But the papers were trying to test theoretical ideas. That was kind of neat. And when that kind of work is done well, it's really nice. Mike Barkley, who was at Rochester and unfortunately died, I think, in 2008, was just really good at that. He wrote some papers that just did that very nicely, were super closely tied to theory, and were very simple empirically and got to the point. They were great. And then we decided that there was an endogeneity problem, and the way to fix that was to get exogenous variation. But that didn't really do anything to fix the problem of things being tied to theory. All it did was get rid of an error regressor correlation, which made the coefficients look difficult to interpret. And so we went crazy looking for exogenous variation. And on some level, I think those papers can be really interesting, but they're not less interesting for fields, say, like corporate finance or household finance than they are for health economics or labor economics, where there are actual programs to evaluate. Because that's where all of that apparatus came from. It came from these fields where we need to evaluate stuff. Like, here's a program, here's something that happened. We want to know what happened. We kind of don't, we're a little bit like I.O. We don't have that in corporate finance. We have some of them, and they need to be evaluated, and they're super interesting, but we don't have them. And those exercises in and of themselves are not necessarily tied to theory. And so then, in the last 10 years, what you see are these papers start with an exogenous shock, and then they say, now we have to find the mechanism. And then they go back to the methods from, say, the 1990s. And like do sample splits or do regressions and stuff like that. And when it's done well, it's super interesting. And it's really, one reason I don't do that kind of work is there's no way I'm going to get this right. It's really hard to do this well. But I think that is where the empirical work has evolved toward. And there, when people look for mechanism, they're essentially testing theory. And I think that's where it would be nice. Sometimes I wish I had a theory co-author on some of my empirical papers. Like half of my CV is empirical. And because I think that coming up with tests like that and having someone who really understands the theory very deeply is super useful. And so I think that one way that empirical work could be made more interesting is just more collaboration with theorists. That's all I have to. I'm not going to talk about structural now. I might do it later. Yeah.
So I must say, like, I think we made a mistake sharing our questions with the panelists because it seems like they tried to tackle all of them in the first 5 minutes. But let's freestyle here. Like one thing that I've heard a lot from colleagues and so on is like the theorists will complain when they get an empiricist as a referee, and the empiricists will complain when they get a theorist as a referee. So, like, perhaps you can speak a little bit more about like judging different types of papers, especially when you're coming from the other side. So we were talking about what makes a good theory paper. What are the mistakes that referees make when they judge, let's say, let's start with theory papers?
Can I start?
Yes, of course.
I tell them not to. So often you get papers that have both an empirical part and a theory part that are, and not just the ones that Gregor was talking about that say that, you know, DADB is positive, but like a genuine like theory part. I tell the theory editor, look, this is obviously part of a joint effort here. Your goal is not to judge the empirical part. Your goal is to tell me if you think that this theory is useful for informing the empirical work. And I'll tell the empiricist, don't try to evaluate the theory. I think that's, so I think that sometimes when we see theorists evaluating empirical work and vice versa, it's an editorial failure.
Yeah, I would agree with that overall. I mean, first of all, when I get a theory paper, I would send it to referees who are theorists. I will not send a theory paper to empiricists and vice versa. When you get a paper that has both, I try to send it to two people. One of them is an expert in theory, one of them is doing more empirical work. And, you know, even if I don't tell them you should focus on that, it comes out very clearly from the report that this is what they were comfortable commenting on. I think largely when people have this view that they like a theory paper and it's evaluated by empiricists, I think it's not that common.
And honestly, like most of the time, if you have a paper that's got, and let's not say structural, but you got a big applied theory one, and then a big empirical piece, it tends to be that one of them is the main contribution. And tends to be that the other one is distracting. And now, it's distracting in terms of, it'd be awesome for someone with unlimited mental capacity and unlimited amount of time, would be awesome to have both. But people don't have that. And you're asking too much of the audience, you're asking too much of the referees to then say, oh, the main contribution is here, but then there's this like theory model that's like pretty good. I mean, on its own, it's not that new. And now sort of think about how, you know, the paper has to be, there is something awesome here that someone needs to be excited about. Personally, I really care, there's something here that somebody is excited about. And then you have something that somebody's like blah about, it's just distracting. So you have to tell me, why do we need this either empirical or theory piece to emphasize the main point and have somebody say, wow, this is really cool. Otherwise, you're just imposing extra costs on the readers. Like that's where I think, and then you get sort of the theorist comes in and says, I'm not excited about the theory piece. And then the empiricist comes in and says, yeah, I'm not that excited about the empirical piece standalone. Then you really need to tell me why you need both pieces to sing together, to tell you something cool and new. And if you're not telling that either, you've probably failed on trying to express why this is cool.
It's very, like we were talking about that yesterday with Louis' paper. It's very hard to have a paper that is successful on both dimensions. And you know, like when I was a PhD student, I had my job market paper at both, and you know, I thought to myself like, never again, right? It's great for the job market, right? Like it's great for the job market because you can like make things interesting for like a broad audience. But do you think it's a good idea to like write these papers that combine empirical and theory? You know?
What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
If there's a point that needs both, it's awesome.
Yeah.
And if there's a point that can be done with primarily one or primarily the other, do that.
I mean, I think, just to follow up on what Gregor is saying, I feel like typically a paper is either primarily a theory paper or primarily an empirical paper. And I think that the type of paper the type of combination that isn't successful is when it's actually endogenous, as in you have either an empirical bit or a theory bit that you feel like, yeah, it's kind of okay, but it doesn't go far enough. And you add the other thing that you add either the missing part And so now you think like somehow that like two not so great parts somehow make for a whole. And that this, by the way, is the same reason why papers should really have one basic insight and not two, because it's not that occasionally, of course, there's a model and it delivers two very deep insights, but more typically what happens when you have a laundry list of insights is, insight number one, yeah, kind of okay, but you were not so excited, so you add some more ingredients and you have now insight number 2 or 3, and then you think, now I have a list of 3, so maybe now it's going to be, so I think it's endogenous, and I'm actually not so sure that this is great advice that somehow something for the job market is the right thing that later isn't. I think it's still, if for the job market it's the same, it's like there's a primary contribution, and then at times it's good to add a little bit of data or add some theoretical framing, but if it's this later variety that I described where you're just trying to put two kind of like things that are not the full pack, two ideas that are not the full package, one empirical, one theoretical, and think now this is somehow super additive, well, guess what? It typically isn't.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the job market. I actually think there is a trend. The job market papers are becoming more complex and longer and have more different methodologies. So it's often the case nowadays that you see in the job market someone will have a model, then they will have a reduced form empirical analysis with some shock or something, and then they will do a structural estimation of the model, and you get the paper and it's like 115 pages, which clearly no one can read and follow. There is clearly a signaling effect that people are trying to signal that they can do this and that. And I think it is becoming worse all the time. I hope it will not continue. I think we need to see more papers on the job market that are pure theory, for example, or pure empirical. We do have the pure empirical papers in the market. We see fewer and fewer pure theory papers on the market, and I think this is not good.
So how do you make these pure theory papers interesting to empiricists?
I guess I can just start following up on what I said. I think pure theory papers have to be relevant. So I think if you start by convincing people that what you're doing is not motivated purely by the model, but is motivated by the real world, your assumptions are interesting, they speak to something that is of broad interest, then empirical people, I think, can find it appealing. Again, going back to what I said before, I don't think you want to come to empiricists and say, look, I have this model that explains everything you found. I think this is probably counterproductive. But if you set up a framework where you try to analyze something that they're looking at and you get some interesting results, hopefully people will find it interesting.
Well, I mean, so I do think that, I actually think like kind of having a deep appreciation for the object of study is very useful. So being grounded in this way that for theory, so theory is necessarily abstract. So in some ways, like I don't think you should be actually judging the model by the assumptions. You should judge it by whether the main way the model thinks is capturing something that you think is happening, is the key thing in the data. In some sense, it's like the assumptions are the price of the price, but you cannot decide whether the price is high or low without understanding what you're buying for it. What you're buying for it is like the basic insight. And that is like, that can be very abstract, but it's got to be about something. And I think, for example, take like Pete Kyle's work. It starts with a deep understanding of like how traders interact in financial markets. He himself was a trader, and so was his father. But then like abstracts completely. But the way the models, and nothing nothing is realistic about the model. The assumptions are, like, if you look at the assumptions, like you would say, like, at face value, you can't decide that this would be a useful way to proceed. But then once you think about how the model works and thinks, you say like, oh, this is very lifelike. And so that's when you conclude that, in fact, the price of entry, the assumptions, were worth paying. And I think it's not, and I completely agree with Itay. Like, you don't want the laundry list of like, there's like, here's the empirical predictions, like, which at times, you know, some people think that's how you make it like useful for empiricists. I think what makes it useful and compelling is if you truly capture something that you see in practice, some trade-off that you see in practice, that's how it becomes appealing. I also think, like, I tell this to theorists often, like, actually one setting where the model fits well, like one very specific setting. Often theorists, they're like, no, my model is not about something. It's like, it's very general, and I actually feel like often, like when you think about Akerlof, it's like about the used car market, or like signaling models. It's about whatever, getting an education and things like this. It's very specific applications, but what convinced people that it is a general deep insight is, in fact, in one setting, it fit very well, and people go like, oh wow, maybe something like this is going on many different places, right? So it's much more compelling. So in some sense, one specific application, and again, there doesn't need to be any data or anything like this, just careful thinking about this one specific application that fits well, I think, actually convinces people much more that the insight is general than like just a strong assertion of the person who wrote the model that in fact it's very general, right? And it seems kind of obvious, but often people want to like not be tied down and think like they can convince you just by asserting it strongly that it's a general insight. Instead of just convincing you by showing, look here, this is a very good way of thinking how this works, and you realize that maybe some of this is elsewhere too, where it's harder to see.
I'm not going to talk about theory, I'm not a theorist.
Well, fair enough. Well, two tools that might look very similar to some people, but might not always be, is like theory and structural, right? Like, so on one end you have like theorists who are trying to find a clean insight and like try to minimize the number of ingredients you need to make your point. And sometimes the structural people are looking at this thinking it's probably too simple and it omits a lot of different things. And you have structural where you're trying to like make the world, or trying to quantify some behaviors, and you need a model that is realistic so that you can capture, kind of how the world works. But on the other hand, like theorists might say, like, well, it's a black box. So how do you like kind of bridge these two types of tools that are to some extent like similar but very different in terms of goals?
Oh, you want to go first? I'm going to let you.
No. For me, it's not about. I think there's two separate things you said there. One is how are these things fundamentally related, and the other one is people say. And I think the people say is kind of an important one for the population. So let me just quote Dean Corbet for me, because I think Dean is just an incredibly insightful, but also like a true scholar. And when I talked to Dean Corbet about a similar issue, which is people to do A judge people B unfavorably, and then people B to do B think that A is and so on. He said, look, this is the way I think about it. If you haven't done it, it's really hard to understand it. So do it. And he said, when I tried to learn about like experimental stuff, I decided to write an experimental paper and learn how it's like actually done, and then that let me really think about that. And I think that honestly, for me, it's the only true way. If you want to think about structural work, do it. You want to judge theorists? Sit down, write a really good model. And until you've been willing to devote 6 months of your life, you're talking from a very superficial level. And some people are in this room are brilliant and insightful and so on, and can speak from a very superficial level and still get things right. But I just doubt that most of us can. So that's one. That's people say. On the how they're related, I think actually, and this is, I think, Toni I'm sure might have had very similar, very different opinions on this. I don't know. But for me, it's sort of when Adriano talks about sparsity, I think in structural models it sort of works the same way. There is one thing that is there is one mechanism that is central to your insight. Maybe there are two because they're related and they're interplaying. The interplay is the really interesting, right? But it's about sort of the clarity of you sort of say, look, there's this one critical thing. I'm glad the way I tell my students is focus a lot of your modeling on the thing that you're trying to pitch as the critical economic mechanism in your model. And then there's some ancillary things you can model or not or take shortcuts at that other people have maybe expand length on. If you can say, you have to be able to somewhat assert that those don't interact with your mechanism in a primary way. Because if they do, then obviously you've got a problem. Right? But otherwise, the name of the game is similar, which is find that critical economic mechanism. But the critical piece is, and we're trying to match data. So it's got to be one that talks to data directly. So the abstraction is there, but the abstraction has to be such that you can still map it in some way to the data. Okay. I think from that perspective, they're very closely related.
I agree. I think they're, in that sense, they're very close related. I do know that some of my own structural papers, after they have been through the referee machine, have turned out to be much more complicated than I ever wanted them to be. And that's a problem that happens. I have always tried to make my own papers, when I've had control over the model, as absolutely simple as I possibly can. And I think that when you're doing structural work, and when you start that way, you'll say, oh my goodness, I'm getting all of this stuff in the data wrong. And it's a natural desire to try to add doodads into models to make them work. But I also think that that makes them much harder to understand. And sometimes you have to, because referees make you. But I do think that makes models much harder to understand. And on some level, their models, they're not going to get it all right. They're just not. They shouldn't get it all right. And I think that one of the things that you can learn a lot from is understanding why models don't get the data right, as well as getting the data right. And then, but that leads me to one other thing I wanted to say, and this is not my thought, this is the thought of a co-author who's actually in this room. And that co-author of a co-author is a theorist who has decided to try to do structural work. And his thought was, oh my goodness, writing down these models, there's a totally different point. It's not to get new insights. It's to find a vehicle to help you understand the data better. And the goals are just so utterly different that the theory models are not going to work to help you understand the data better. That's not their goal. The Kyle model's not going to work. There are no, what are you going to do? Find data on noise traders? We don't see those things. And I think that often people, like what I've had papers rejected, there's no new theoretical insight in your model. It's like, no, there isn't. And because on some level there really is, you're trying to understand the data from a model that is designed to try to understand the data more closely, which is, that's the Allen wrench in the toolbox. It's not the screwdriver or the hammer. It's the thing that you actually put the bicycles together with. And so I think it's just a different toolbox. And we see a lot of structural papers that are overcomplicated, and I think that's too bad. I wish they could be simpler, because they can be. We just have to have more tolerance for getting the data wrong and understanding why.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I do think that this, and I try to think about so first, Toni was saying, oh, but then the referee process made me kind of do it and add extra ingredients. And I always argue, we have agency, we are the profession. So we are all referees, and we should understand that models should be allowed to fail on certain dimensions, quantitative models, by the way, even empirical papers, and just like exactly like a theory will have some basic predictions, but in some other dimensions, it might very well be very strongly counterfactual. I think at times I ask myself, what would make so first, when you're a referee, and you're refereeing a quantitative paper, and it fails in a certain dimension, this should be discussed, but it shouldn't be fixed to add extra ingredients to make it a Frankenstein model, in my view. So we shouldn't accept that the referee, and you hear this, quantitative people say this all the time, oh, I need to put this in because otherwise I would never get it through the referees. Even before the referees actually insist on fixing something. It's just like the referee will discover that in this dimension the model fails. So I must fix it ex ante. And I think maybe one thing that would help is if every quantitative paper would have a mandatory last section that says, here's the 3 features of the data in which the model that are the most challenging for the model. And by the way, I don't think actually this is just for quantitative. I think like a theory paper should have a mandatory last section that says, here's the 3 most plausible ways of toppling the result. Or the empirical paper should be, here's the 3 key features, and by the way, 3 is obviously not relevant, but here's the 3 key features of the data that, like, with the basic way of how I'm saying what the story is in this data set, here's the 3 patterns that least fit with this. And I think we will be all better off. First, we might be more accepting of the fact that right now the state of the art is hide as best you possibly can the 3 features of the data that don't fit your empirical, the overall story that you're telling. Put maybe extra ingredients to fix in the quantitative work those features or hide them. Or when you do theory, you try to say, oh, in these 2 dimensions is robust, but there's the elephant in the room that you're trying to hide. And I think, like, as a science, we'd be much better off if we would have, like, it's actually much more valuable to know how to, where is the tension for people who come after you. And maybe it makes us actually more accepting of the fact that all theory, quantitative, empirical papers have these tensions. And maybe we'll be a whole lot more productive.
So I agree with that. You know, one of the very first structural finance papers was Hansen and Singleton. And it was a disaster. It did not fit the data. It was a mess. It created the equity premium puzzle, but we still learned a lot from it.
I think the most important thing when you think about different methodologies is to be open-minded and accept the other methodologies. So, one thing I realized for a long time, but it gets stronger over time, as you do research in finance and economics, is that there is a lot out there that we still don't understand. So I think we cannot be too tied to any particular methodology. I think there is room for new theory to deliver new insights. There is room for structural estimation to link it more closely to the data. There is room for reduced form empirical work. I think all of this is important. And I think if all of us accept that and don't say, I don't like reduced form empirical, I don't like structural, I think that would be a much more constructive debate.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Maybe just to follow up, I actually feel like now I see it in students, like in grad school, so it starts at day 1. There's empiricists that they come to the theory class with the attitude like, oh, I don't need theory because I'm going to be an empiricist. And I try, and I think we all should, I try to strongly push against this view. And by the way, both ways, I think theorists need to be aware of and understand empirical methods. Why? So that they understand what is credible evidence, what are facts that they should want to grapple with or not. And empiricists should not just learn theory. So here's, if all you do in grad school is learn theory, here's what happens. the median paper that people write in their career, they're like 10 to 15 years out. That's when they write their median paper. They went to graduate school, so 15 years earlier. What they learn in graduate school is typically at least 15 years old, often older. So what this means is the way they think about the data when they look at the data is like from the vantage point of complete vintage points of view. Like they're stuck in the 1970s in how they look at the data. And then they're surprised that when you look at the empirical work, it's like, this is like evidence on how people, on the pros and cons of various points of view from the 1970s. What obviously is much more useful is, so when you go to graduate schools in Paris, you don't just need to learn the theory, because it's not an answer. You need to learn how to learn theory and how to keep up with it. And I see a lot of empiricists go on to very productive careers who have this ability to continue to keep up with theory, be informed by kind of the current edge, if you want, of theory. And because the current edge of theory also provides new perspectives to look at the data, odds are that the new perspectives are perspectives that people haven't taken as much yet. And so there's a lot more to say on that. And there's an extra benefit, which is the results are then of interest in forming theorists currently working. So I think like but again, I think it goes both ways. But I think it's an attitude that's like, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that needs to be pushed against starting in graduate school.
I don't think I agree with Adriano. I mean, I agree with Adriano on some very broad point, but it's like, I want to teach people how to be sprinters, and people can't walk. And the reality is, even pretty darn good empirical papers we get, with really good facts and so on, don't even have one organizing framework. You look at the facts, and they sort of have an introduction that sort of wants to kind of maybe speak to theory, but when you start linking all the facts in the paper, they don't fall under the same framework, okay? So, just a theory, like learning how to organize one set of empirical facts in some coherent set would already be a lot of progress. You're asking people to do not just that, but have it be a theoretical framework that is super recent. And I think that's asking way more than like small progress, which is you have a bunch of facts in the paper. Tell me exactly how all of these facts are linked in one, not necessarily a formal model, but an informal framework. I think that would be a huge step forward. So I think you're just asking way too much. And smaller goals that most people can achieve are better than lofty goals that very few people can achieve.
Can I make sense of these two ideas? So I agree with both of them. I think it's really hard to do what Gregor wants unless you have a broad knowledge of stuff.
I agree with that.
And I think you were talking about gaining a broad knowledge of stuff and being open, and what Itay was saying, just being open to different, like, we really don't care about Allen wrenches and screwdrivers and hammers. And to have a broad background so that you can actually learn how to do, create a paper, which is what you see as an editor. You see these papers that are just all over the place.
Or they're at least sort of not, they start with a story, and then there's one fact that's sort of there, but then there's a bunch of facts, and they sort of don't kind of fit the same. I mean, they sort of are loosely related, but if you actually wrote down the model, you'd see that they're drifting. And then, maybe they're not even explained by this model, they're explained by another model, and you have two models now that are kind of running parallel. And like, I would love if we were in an Adriano world in which people not just understood theory, but continuously kept up with it. But I think that's a goal that I think is like, way down the line from my goal, which is just having people competent in theory enough that they can organize facts in an empirical paper in a coherent framework. And I think that's just, it's a much more modest goal, and I think if we get there, I'd be already really happy.
The question, I guess, is how you get there. And I think, like, if you're framing in this way, you're not going to, the way you're framing it, I don't think you will get there. I think the way you get there is by people understanding that they need to not just learn a couple of models so that they can later cite them, in kind of a perfunctory way anyway, missing missing the main insight of the model to begin with, which is a lot of what is done. And I think the only way to do it is like you actually have to. I just think it's not too high a goal that you have to understand what models say, and like certainly the graduate students need to learn. Like, I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on their training, but it's kind of like a unity of science kind of thing. Like you want to do good empirical work, you have to know how to think about economic mechanisms, and the only way to do it is to learn theory. And again, I think so. And I think like it doesn't mean that you have to like not be on top of all the most latest tools on either the empirical or the theory side, but you have to have the basic. You have to have the basic intention and practice of keeping up with what people are doing. I don't think it's actually too lofty of a goal. I mean, I think it's also like, I think in some sense like what I see in the empirical work that kind of like then like tries to organize the thing, the results in some framework. I feel like often what ends up happening is the hypothesis is completely harked. It's completely hypothesized after the results are known. And you can immediately tell, because it's not some theory papers that are referred to. It's like, here's the theory, here's the 3 theory papers, and then here's the mechanism that I'm proposing. And it's like, and it seems a little bit like specific and like maybe unusual. And it's exactly because it's really just data description, because it is actually, it's the feature of the data that one happened to find that is then presented as a hypothesis. And I think that's like, and I think that's what I'm pushing against. And I think it comes from like not organizing things from the get-go, from thinking from the vantage point of theory.
I don't think there is a big disagreement here. I think you're basically.
I think you're both saying the same thing.
None of them works closer to me. I think he walked away from people to be able to hear.
I think you're both saying that we want people to understand theory.
Yeah.
You know, ideally they should understand every theory, but that's probably not what we're going to get. So there must be something. But I think the most important thing, going back to being open-minded, I talked about empirical versus theoretical versus structural. I think also within theory, we want people to be open-minded. And maybe what you're saying is you don't want them to be just stuck with one model that they saw 20 years ago and try to filter everything through that, but also be accepting that there are new types of theories and new ways to think about things and just update themselves.
So I did the PhD admission this year at Wharton, and one trend I noticed that might be dangerous for the kind of the bridging between theory and empirical work is the popularity of pre-doc programs, where students show up and they know exactly what their dissertation will be about. Like they said, I cleaned data for a year, now I know exactly what my dissertation will be about, and then there's like, you want to tell them, like, slow down, like, we have 2 years worth of classes coming that will inform you about like the potential topics you could work on, the potential tools you could use. So I think like, in there's a trend that we need to think about in terms of admission, in terms of how we train students. Do you have, above and beyond the idea of saying like, empiricists, you need to learn theory, and theorists, you need to learn empiricism. Do you have advice or suggestions for like supervising PhD students, training them, and so on?
So I know a little bit about where this comes from. So many PhD students have told me, well, of course I said I knew exactly what I wanted to do. That's the only way to get into graduate school. So there's this belief of, and in the modern world of social media, they all talk to each other. Like all the FedRAs talk to each other. So I think that there's this idea that they have to know what they want to do. And so I think that might be less of a problem, because I think they're just trying to signal But the pre-doc thing emphasizes, can you run computer code? And I think that that's not entirely, like, can you run Stata code, or can you clean data with pandas, or something like that? And I don't think that that's the entirety of the skill set that you need to go into a PhD program. I think that's the bigger problem.
I mean, I think it sort of comes down to us, right? Which is how do we, think of the general. I mean, I think given that we have fewer econometricians here, let's have a Toni, which is a former econometrician or something.
Yeah, so that has,
But think of how think of how a lot of times econometrics is taught in a PhD program. People walk in, and then the first econometrics class is taught with a bunch of proofs that people who will actually use this stuff will actually be empiricists, will never care about people, and the people who will be econometricians already know. So it is targeted to serve exactly no one. Right? It's neither the econometricians nor the applied people. And I think sometimes we do that with theory classes. We target them at slightly too low a level for people who really want to be theorists. And we sort of don't think about, well, if you're going to be the kind of person who chances are not going to be writing, so the question is there a way to think about how we teach our PhD students theory in a way that we're going to achieve Adriano or my goals or whoever's goals, that empiricists are theory conversant in a way that they have coherent papers? I think I don't have an answer. It's more of but maybe that's one thing we should think about.
I mean, I do worry a little bit about the pre-doc program. The fact that they did research for 2 years, and when they come into the PhD program, they feel like they should just continue doing this research. So they take the courses because they have to. But at the end of the day, if they're already working on this research, the easiest thing for them is just to continue with that. And that might not be good for the long-term research.
I mean, I think like the extra aspect of this is that pre-doc programs, I guess the utilization of RAs in empirical work is much higher than in theory. So one thing that does is, like, if one, for example, were to essentially require a pre-doc to get into graduate school, that would bias strongly the pool of applicants towards empiricists. And I certainly feel like the theory is exceptionally valuable in terms of trying to understand the world. So that would be a strong reason not to bias your pool too strongly towards people who have pre-docs. I mean, what's the equivalent of that? First, it means that when we do pre-docs, maybe we should have more theory pre-docs also. And I think it's something we're certainly considering. But in addition to that, I think what's the equivalent of a pre-doc for the more theory-inclined people? I guess it's like it's a master's degree somewhere, and so. But it's certainly, like, in admissions, to me at least, it's very important not to think that having a pre-doc is in some sense a necessary condition. And as Toni was saying, like, everybody communicates, so the message should certainly be very loud and clear that having a pre-doc is in no way a requirement to get into graduate school, because I think that will put beyond the thing that people might continue what they're already doing. I think it will be very detrimental to the pool of talent that we would attract in our field.
And I don't know what a pre-doc would even do for structural. It's not like you can just run pandas code. You have to learn how to do all this stuff, and by the time they learned all the stuff, the pre-doc would be over. So they wouldn't even be, it would just as if they were, like, taking classes from you personally, and it wouldn't be something that you could even think about, and in theory too, right? But I think that the pre-doc thing is really just, can you run pandas and Stata?
Good. So I think, like, this should have sparked a lot of new, like, ideas for questions from the audience, but we already submitted some of them that we asked. So I think it's a good time to open the floor for questions.
And we'll give microphones so that, because we are recording, that way you, it can actually, can hear your questions.
Just make sure.
So thank you very much for doing this. I wanted to piggyback on a few things that came up. Adriano, obviously, I think in the Platonic ideal of, use the screwdriver, use the hammer, I think there's no objection, and I completely agree. I was wondering more about the sociology of it in the sense that, you get better at swinging a hammer the more you use it, and so there's a risk that people specialize, and I think at least among some junior theorists, there's this idea that maybe theory is becoming more insular, and there's evaluation criteria that are specific to the way theories judge something that aren't necessarily widely shared, and that can create some problems in the publication process or career progression and so forth. I was wondering if you as editors or you see similar trends, or if you think that's a concern or not really.
I think people specialize and probably should specialize, because at the end of the day, you get better at what you're doing the more you're doing it. I think really the art is to specialize but remain open-minded and explore new dimensions that you can introduce into your work. I don't think this is a huge concern. I think that people should go into a field, start doing a certain type of work, continue to build on it. The fact that there are going to be potentially different criteria across different subfields, yeah, probably. I think it's hard to avoid it. It depends on the people working in that particular field. So as long as we are all sort of aware of it and try to adjust for it, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's just comparative advantage. So in some sense, a little bit, I don't think you need to use all the tools yourself, but you should, but you also should not disrespect other people who use different tools. Instead, you should understand them at the level where you can benefit from what they accomplish using these other tools. And so I'm not at all concerned if you're for people who do theoretical work, if they're pure theorists. I think that's natural and makes a lot of sense, and actually can lead to a very promising career. I do think it's not useful to be insular in terms of not letting yourself be informed by whatever is whatever are the empirical tensions that people currently on the empirical side document, and being inspired by that to think about things from a theoretical perspective and mechanisms, I think is very useful. So I think it's the insularity in terms of what you influence, what you're following, more so than what you're doing that I think it would be problematic.
Thank you for doing this. It's really useful. I wanted to follow up on some of your points, in particular Toni's on combining empirical and theory, or in papers that combine theory and empirics, and they use a model as a tool to actually analyze the data. If those papers get sent as both, I think Itay, you mentioned, to a theory referee and an empirical referee. A theory referee perhaps will just needing one, for instance, could impose a really high bar on the theory part. And I guess to some extent the flip side would be for theory paper that use some data to validate the model or motivate the model. And the empirical referee in this case could use a really high bar for actually the purpose of the analysis. So I'm not really sure how these papers fit or fall through the cracks or don't fall through the cracks. What's your view on it?
Once again, I think it's a little bit about the editor being very clear about what they want from the referee. So most of the time when I send out referee requests, it's like, check this box, check that box, check this box, click send. But for 4 papers where I want referees to, I want to know one exact, like I want to know something that that person can inform me about, I'll click, 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 and then edit. And I think that that's a way to get around that problem, because sometimes these papers that combine both can actually get at a single point and make a clear, nice point, and you need both bits.
My view is that it's on the author to be very clear in the paper about where the contribution lies.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you say like, oh, I have a model, and like it's a cool model, and then people think, oh, look, the contribution is in theory. And then the theorist says, oh, it's me providing the theory. Oh, I have this cool data, and I have this experiment. And the empiricist says, tell the reader what the cool thing, new thing, pushing things forward is. And if it requires, and look, this new insight requires me to simultaneously apply theory and empirics, you say that. And then when you have the related literature, you say, you know, this is the related work in theory. I don't bring new theoretical insights here. What I do is, what's special about my paper is, I use my model to study data in this particular way, and that's new. But I think it's up to you to explain to the readers why you are pushing the world forward in a way that they should care. I think in some ways, you know, and we all fail on this, but you know, some of us more than others. But I think it's really critical for you to explain to the reader, and therefore to the referees. Like, I tend to write, people fail in 2 places a lot of times, especially young people in papers. It's page 1 and related literature.
Yeah.
Page 1 is verbiosity on like blah, 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 blah. Adverse selection is really important. The world is a complicated place. You know, rather than say like, here is what is new on in my paper, and here's how I'm moving the world forward.
Yeah.
And then related literature, which people write as, and there are a bunch of papers
And here's
that
what
are
they
related to my paper, and here's what they do. And then there is the like, and what's missing is literally the, and here is where my paper moves the world forward. Like the related literature piece is actually kind of important. And most people are super lazy on it. And especially if you're working in something that is not exactly your bailiwick, where it just like comes naturally, you gotta do the work. Gotta do the work and say, and this is the closest thing, and here is where I move the world forward, and here is why you, as a referee, as a reader, as an author, should be excited about my paper moving the boundaries of knowledge. So I think that's a lot of times where these things actually fail.
I mean, I think, you know, a paper at the end of the day has to make a contribution, either on the theory side or on the empirical side, or there is something that comes out of the synergy between the two, and that has to come out clearly. I said before that if there is a paper that does theory and empirical, I'll try to have someone who is coming more from the theory side and someone more from the empirical side. But that doesn't mean that the theorist is going to be blind to the empirical contribution or vice versa. So, you know, I always try to pick people that I think are open-minded and can see through also the other methodology. So I don't think, you know, the theorist is going to put a too high bar on the theory side and the empiricist is going to put a too high bar on the empirical side. You know, generally, I think people should be able to see where the contribution is coming from.
I mean, what's more is that the editor also has agency, right? So it's not like just because the editor might send the paper to a pure theorist, and the pure theorist says, oh, this, I mean, it's well done, but there's nothing new here. But if you're making an editorial decision, so what? That's what you were expecting. Just like at times the editor sends the paper to somebody who is clearly going to be critical of this type of work, just to see like what is the worst case scenario you can make against the paper, and then decide that okay, if this is the very critical point of view, then this is worth publishing. So I don't feel like there's this like I think we're like a little too concerned about you know, being held to the being evaluated by the min. Because there's no mechanical evaluation that maps from referee reports to decisions.
But don't you think that in a situation where you send this to a theorist, is because when you read the paper, you thought there was a contribution in theory, and it's the author's job to be clear on where the contribution is. So partly, if there was a
Absolutely, of course.
super theorist that landed on this paper and said there was no theoretical contribution, the author might have implied, maybe by being vague about the contribution, there is one. So you thought, oh, this is a sensible referee to evaluate this, even though the author would have said, but yeah, if you really push me, it's not. So that's why I think it's sort of kind of important. Right?
It should, certainly, but at the same time, you might send a paper to a theorist that is primarily, the contribution is primarily taking this class of models to the data, but it's this class of models that this theorist is very, very familiar with. And just to ensure that, in fact, the way people take it to the data is about the main mechanism in the model, right? And so you're not,
And you didn't expect that the referee would say, and there's no theory contribution here, because the paper would be written in a way that it wouldn't be like, and I'm moving the theory forward. Right? They wouldn't be saying, reject this paper because there is no theory contribution in a paper where it's very clear that the contribution is not about theory. I mean, maybe they would be.
Yeah.
We're all people, we can
Yeah,
raise
exactly.
things, but on average.
But you would then not map this into, like I say, like even if this were to happen, there's still a decision to be made of what you do with this referee report. And I don't think it will be mapped into, oh, but the theorist said it was no theoretical contribution, which I never thought there was. I was trying to make sure that it's actually,
Gregor, related to your point, you're handling theory papers, you're handling empirical papers. Are theorists worse at the page one mistake? Like often.
No, I think it's just we're some of us we're all not great at it. I think if there were a correlation, I think older people are better at it because they got more experience.
Yeah.
But it's a vague correlation. It's like
I agree. I think it's you see the page 1, 2, and 3 going blah 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 more among younger authors, and it's sad because often these papers are actually really interesting, and it's just hard to figure out why. Yeah.
So I have kind of some remark on personal experience, and then I have a question to the panel.
Oh no!
So I teach corporate finance theory here at Boston College, and the vast majority of our PhD students are primarily interested in doing empirical work. And I thought a lot about kind of how could I kind of teach theory in a way that's useful for somebody who would most likely be not doing it. And this year I kind of decided to introduce an assignment where I basically ask PhD students to pick an empirical paper. It can be one paper or a couple of closely related papers. So I recommend kind of recently published, but it doesn't have to be. And I ask them to kind of sketch a theory model that confess closely, they think, given what they learned from the paper, the model of the world, whatever application that's modeling, and ask them not to force it. So if there's something contradicts, be open and kind of speculate why. And I think students did learn a lot, and they also kind of got appreciation for theory work, even if that's not what they are interested. And then kind of the question I have for the panel is, so like for somebody, say PhD student interested in theory or a junior faculty doing in theory, what advice would you give to kind of write theory in a way that will be read by empiricists, that will make an impact on empiricists, other than kind of just like trying to make the assumptions relevant, which I of course completely agree with.
Maybe the question specifically to Gregor and Toy. I had the same question because you both said we will not comment, but it would be very interesting for, I think, theorists, right, to know what, right?
I don't know. This is on you. This is really hard.
I
don't know. Write it on paper. The only feedback I have directly, I would say, off of. So let me change the question because I'm not sure I can answer that So let me change it to when I've read theory papers, and I have written theory papers in the past, but I haven't done it in a while, computer theory. But one thing that struck me, even in papers that I accepted in the end, was how lazy the empirical thing was. And I don't mean picking the empirical facts, but relating it to the real world. Like for example, specifically in banking, you know? You have papers, it's a banking paper, it's about something, something, something. And I'm like, you know, I think about banking a lot. I look at this model, I look at the world, I see a lot of things in the world you could talk about right now. But you know, you're talking to me about like 1985, one piece of thing that you found that supports a story. It's just lazy. And you could do better. And I think partly it's just to be engaged much more with the world. Like in principle, finance theory is applied theory. Okay? Like, and there are some great people here who write fundamental, you know, let's call it less applied theory and more like old school like theory, but most of it is applied theory. If you're gonna write applied theory, you're gonna write applied theory, you're gonna claim it's in banking. There's no excuse that you didn't crack open, you know, the Wall Street Journal in the last decade and knew nothing about what was happening. And it just, that would be the only real feedback I can give on this dimension, which is just an incredible failure to engage with the world, as opposed to like, is there something very specific that would make things more appealing? Just engage more with the world, especially when you have a model that can actually speak to things.
But I mean, what I worry about when I listen to you is that people will come out thinking that there is a communication failure because of one side. I actually think it's two-sided. I think that empiricists are not paying enough attention to theoretical papers, and theorists are not paying enough attention to empirical papers. So I don't think you can just blame theorists for not making their papers sufficiently interesting for empiricists. I think it goes both ways.
None of us read enough of other people's work.
So there's that. I also think it's when I read theory papers, it really helps if the introduction is crystal clear. I think that makes, because then if it's a real theoretical contribution, it has an insight, and the insight should be more than the solution to an equation. There should be something intuitive that you should be able to write clearly. And for me, when I read pure theory papers, I really love it when the introduction is incredibly intuitively clear. And I think that would make, and it also goes the other way, right? But I think that's the thing that certainly makes me want to really understand theory papers better, is when the introduction is intuitively clear.
And I think often, like, to get it there, you actually need to really understand the model at a much deeper level to be able to explain it, the basic insight, in a clear way on page 1 of your introduction. And so this is also, again, like, where if you're not meeting, like, sometimes this is like laziness in a different way if you want. I mean, I don't know whether laziness is the right way to say it, but like not pushing it all the way of thinking through what really is the economic intuition for the basic mechanism to the point where you can actually explain it. So in some sense, it's often a result of still not quite understanding what the model is actually saying.
To follow up on Itay's point, a question maybe to Gregor and Toni specifically, and we got it a little bit from Gregor, but in a very applied way, right? When you see empirical papers that don't do a good job at bridging, right, with theory, what are the typical mistakes that people do?
I think it's people are very superficial about theory. I mean, it's just, they will quote things like debt overhang and not really understand what it is. They will quote risk shifting and, Adriano was saying, oh, people are stuck in the 1990s. That's why I pushed back. Like, people don't even understand debt overhang and risk shifting or speak of them incredibly loosely. Maybe they understand them, but when they write papers, they are very, very loose with even understanding of like, what constraints do those models put. I think that's sort of the, that's my issue. Look, so would I love if everybody was forced to write down a simple model for their empirical paper and then we would put that in Appendix Z? Sure, I mean, it would make, for a much more coherent paper. Just, I think that's really it. That just people find some, I have a comparative static and data. there's a paper that I vaguely understand that has having that comparative study. More debt, less investment. Therefore, debt overhang. Therefore, people have, when people get more constrained financially, they take more risk. It has to be risk shifting. And it's just, not investing enough to kind of think about the proper, the simplest, cleanest economic model that is actually constrained within that model that explains the data, I think is a big problem.
I think people don't go to the core of the mechanism when they cite
that's right.
theoretical papers. They would say things like, agency problems are important in corporate finance, and then put like 4 random sites to papers that maybe they have agency problems, maybe they don't.
People who talk about sort of vaguely multiple equilibria, they cite Morris and Shen. I hope more laughter in room of theorists. So now we know who gets it. But it's a laziness of
I think a lot of this comes from the fact that finance, more than economics, is data-driven, and on some level that's super good, right? And it's become more data-driven because there's more data to drive things. It's easier to get data. You don't have to walk to the library and copy stuff out of books. I don't know, I did that at one point. But the data is more gettable. And for that reason, I think that a lot of empirical papers, probably the main reason I reject empirical papers is loose conceptual underpinnings. It's not your instrument is bad or this or that, it's loose conceptual underpinnings. And so I think that's where having having input from theorists who understand this well is useful. And the other thing that I've noticed over years, we have more working in teams, which is both also good and bad. But to have theorists on empirical teams, it could be just so very helpful.
I mean, maybe with just one thing to, on this idea of adding a model, I actually much prefer if one gives, here's the key paper on this, and then here's the most strict version of that particular model, and that goes into the appendix, instead of citing kind of superficially a bunch of related theory papers and then doing some half-baked attempt that here's my own model, but it's actually not quite what it says it is, and it's not what, so I think more explicitly basing the framing on the fully specified actual models, as opposed to kind of citing some models and then writing some ad hoc model that leaves most questions unanswered, I think so that's why this thing of writing your own little model, I much rather see a baby version of an existing model.
I think Sergey is next.
Thank you. I have a question about structural estimation. What should be standard for identification of structural estimation? In empirical research, we reach a stage where people have various experiments, a lot of robustness tests, but in structural estimation, for example, people use flat shifters. I do it myself, but really many peers will argue that they're endogenous. So what should be the standard for publication of structural estimation papers?
I've thought about this a lot. So one of the problems is that structural estimation encompasses a lot of different stuff. Demand estimation is structural estimation, and when you do a demand estimation, you really, you have the supply-demand endogeneity problem. You need an instrument. If the stuff that I do is not demand estimation, it's matching moments from the data. So I think that, can I talk about the stuff that I do? Because I've been dabbling in I/O, but it's not my bread and butter. So one thing that drives me insane and is just utterly wrong is there's this notion out there that you need exogenous variation to identify parameters when you're doing, say, simulated method of moments. And if you're wondering why my laptop will open, it's because I'm cold and I'm running an SMM to keep me warm. So in any case, not a necessary condition because you're doing something different. You have a parameter that's supposed to capture something, if you're doing it well, something reasonably deep, and you want to find a feature of the data that when you move that parameter, that feature of the data moves, and you want it to look like this, with a nice, unique minimum. You don't need, so it's identification in the econometric sense. One of the main reasons I reject structural papers is because they don't do a good job of that. They don't discuss that, they don't understand the model very well, it's just blip.
Greg?
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, no, I think no, because you want to talk about I/O, because that's
No,
different.
it's not just, I actually don't think it's I/O specific. I mean, my view is why structural papers kind of hard is because I do think you have to pre-write a reduced form paper that need not have identification in the standard IV sense, but you have to have a set of facts that convince the reader that the mechanism you're modeling is first order in driving the data. Right? So before somebody jumps into your thing, like into your model, they should kind of be convinced that the mechanism you're going to be talking about is already like it's happening. Then you have the model. Now you can introduce a bunch of things in the model. Now you can put IVs. You can, RD. You can introduce directly moments from an RD in the model. You could do that. But I think the key thing is, by the time somebody's done reading your empirical section on the 5 pages that you're given for that, because people don't have patience, they need to be sort of convinced, I think, in your main economic story. And then you're building a model to capture that and saying, and because I built this model, look, there's some insights you probably couldn't have had without the model. Because sometimes, like, I've learned this on my own things. Like, I thought I understood them, my models tend to be simple. And then when I've done some kind of factuals, there's some surprising things that popped out. Okay, so there's some cool stuff you wouldn't have learned without doing the model. And there's some quantitative insights you couldn't have had without. But the point is, you already have had to convince people of the mechanism, which is mostly what reduced form people do, just to get less space for it. And that makes it like really hard and a lot of work. So you better have a good payoff to it. I mean, that's sort of my big view on this. And you can do very reduced form like diff and diff, or RD, or IV, or you can just say, look, here's a bunch of facts. These facts kind of sort of rule in on demand shock, because we know that supply will go the other way. And I'm going to run with this. And that probably gets you pretty darn far. Again, depends on what the objective is and where you shouldn't have quote unquote exogeneity in your model. Is where the first order thing you're abstracting away is going to interact with your main mechanism. Right? That's the key thing you don't want to miss.
So I want to push back on one thing. So you were saying one of your moments could be an RD or an IV estimate. That people think that's necessary. It's useful if you want to connect your model to a part of your paper that's empirical that is an RDD or a dip and dip or something like that. But I have this paper that's in the RCFS several years ago.
That was good.
Really? Yeah. Oh, I didn't know. I forgot. No, this was my cavalcade. This was the thing from the cavalcade. So we did this on Monte Carlo, and we had we tried 2 identifying moments. One was an endogenous correlation, and one was an exogenous correlation. And when you're doing the Monte Carlo, you're playing God, so you really can have an exogenous correlation. It didn't make any difference, because all of the parameters in the model interacted to affect both of these things, albeit in slightly different ways. So I think that the reason why you might want to have a well-defined thing as a moment would be to directly connect it to some well-defined work that you're doing, but it's not necessary for identification itself. There you go. I just had to say that.
Okay, Greg?
I had a question about Gregor's comment about organizing empirical facts into a single framework. So if there's not like an off-the-shelf framework that fits into, but you can't maybe fully just verbally argue that framework, and let's say the contribution of the paper is predominantly empirical, is there value in kind of putting a model together just to say, hey, like this is indeed what the equilibrium would look like, I'm not just saying that and maybe putting in the back, or do you think that's kind of a waste of time?
My view is it's always useful for you. No, I'm serious. It is always useful for you. The big question is, and you can even test this out on your colleagues. Like, put a big, you put the thing in, and you see, like, they're reading it. They're like, oh, it was so good, and I had a model there. I finally understood it. Or like, this was like, it made your paper kind of a slog to read. And by the point I got to like the main part, I was kind of tired. It's true, it just happens. So I, for me, that's the main trade-off, which is, are you pushing people's attention away from the main thing? Can they understand the main thing without having necessarily worked through the thing? But putting it in the appendix to say for people who are more thoughtful and say, you have this story, I'm kind of iffy if this is really the equilibrium, you have an appendix. I mean, that's like a robustness,
I think it is useful. I think if you have empirical results that you cannot fit into any existing framework, I think showing how you can fit them, I think it is useful. So I would say have a model in this case. Whether you put it in section 2 or 7 or appendix, I think that's another question. But I think having it is useful.
I think it's just important to not succumb to this temptation of like there's one extra feature of the data and you just cannot resist the temptation of harking an extra ingredient into the model. It's okay for it's kind of the same thing as in quantitative where the model should be allowed to not capture some of the features of the data and almost have a tension with respect to them. And I think both as authors and as whatever referees and editors, we should be forgiving in that, because otherwise you end up with models that are not helpful anymore.
And just to add to this, I think very often the way to solve this compromise, right, to not slow down the reader, is do it, right? It's useful. Put it in the appendix and then write a 2-page framework in words. That will actually help the readers a lot without, texting them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this very informative discussion and insights on writing good papers to bridge theory and empirics. I would love to hear your thoughts about how to write good referee reports to fill this break, because for most people in this room, I feel like we write way more referee reports than papers. I do feel that we have too little education on writing good referee reports than writing good papers. So I would love to hear your thoughts, maybe also as a coordination device, to a group of junior people. So going forward, what would be the right thing to write?
So, can I start? I don't know, I have lexicographic preferences as an editor, but the first thing I care about is somebody besides the author going to care about this? And so as from a referee, I want to know if it pushes the field forward. That's the first thing, that's the main thing I want to know. And I don't...
Which field?
Yeah,
how much?
Yeah, by which field and how much. But I want to know if somebody else is actually going to care about this. I think that's the main thing that I care about. And then I care about whether it's properly executed and all of this other stuff. But I think that's the main thing. The other thing is, I don't think that it's useful to be a shadow, if you're going to do an R&R, recommend an R&R, it's not useful to be a shadow co-author. Because then I have to go through and say, don't do this, don't do that, because it's too much work. So I think that if you like papers, you like the paper, and you have a few ways that you might want to massage it into place, but I think that being a shadow co-author and asking for 27 things is not helpful. So those are the two. I'm sure they have many more useful things to say, but the first thing I care about is there something here? And if you do like the paper, don't go crazy and ask them to do 27 things.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think a good referee report will make a few key points, and they can be about the contribution, there is a major contribution or not. It can be about the methodology, there is a big problem in how they're approaching it. It can be about the relation to the literature, maybe they are not getting it completely right. So I think a good referee report will just focus on, 3, 4, 5 main points and highlight them and explain them, and then explain why they either lead to a rejection, a commendation, or a revised submittal recommendation. It's useful to have a bunch of minor points, but I think you want to maybe say explicitly that these are more minor. I don't like referee reports that are too long. I think if you send like 10 pages, it's probably an overkill, but also too short. If it's just one page and you just say, no, there's nothing here, it's also not super helpful. So getting it right in the middle, I would say.
From what I find incredibly frustrating is when people say either there is no contribution and they don't tell me why. Like, oh, people have done this. What mythical people have done this? Can you give me a paper? In fact, give me a paper. Or, oh, this is very cool. Why? The key standard for me is this paper publishable in the RFS? For that, it's got to have two things, right? It's got to be, someone's got to be really excited about it, which means it's got to push some literature forward, and it can't be wrong on the fundamental thing that people are excited about. So what are the things that prevent this paper to be publishable? Okay? And if it's the contribution, okay? If it's execution, is it something that the author can sensibly do in one round? If it's the author needs to write a separate paper, estimate a structural model, go to the moon, collect data, like that's not hard enough. What's a plausible path to publication where you have an explicit thing that in the one round, if the author does 1, 2, 3, it's over the bar. That's what I need. And if it's not, tell me the primary things that make this paper not publishable in that in one round, you will not, it's kind of implausible that they will get to the important things. And chances are, if you're unexcited about a paper or you're like, it's pretty darn close, I care about the right tail. I think, for me, the death knell is two people who are just like, I don't care how right the paper is if no one's excited.
I think one more thing, this is maybe also to editors. I think like one really good way of learning how to write referee reports is reading other people's referee reports. So I do think it's very valuable, and many econ journals do it, and not all finance journals do it as their standard protocol is to share all the referee reports with the various referees, and then you go ahead and read them. And the time you read them, and you feel like, oh, my referee report was the weakest link, and you feel like I better step up my game, or you see some referee reports that you feel like this person did a really good job, and I feel like you learn a lot from that. So with that in mind, I think it's very useful for editors to actually share the other referee reports with the referees, and when you get them sent to you, read them.
Don't do the labor theory of value, which is somebody wrote, I wrote a 3-page report, I feel badly because somebody wrote a 10-page report.
Yeah.
That's the wrong updating.
Absolutely.
That's the only thing I would do.
No, absolutely. And also like this at times people say like, oh, but I must impress the editor, and I must be critical. But also that is, I think like if you have 3 things, like 2 ways of like why this, like what is the key contribution and how to formulate that are positive, focusing much more on that. It's not like you don't impress people by just I must be critical, so that somehow will make people more appreciate my judgment.
Okay, so people are cold, people are hungry.